Today we're coming to you live from CNN's Jerusalem Bureau. Mitt Romney left here earlier today. He's now in Poland, where he's already met with the country's legendary former president-elect Wałęsa. We're going to have a live report in our next hour from Poland, but we begin this hour with my one-on-one interview with the Republican presidential candidate. Governor Romney, thanks so much for joining us in Jerusalem. What a beautiful city, and I'm sure you've been moved by what you've seen so far.
Well, it's a holy city, a city of a great and courageous people. My wife and I first came here in 1995 and have been here 4 times now. We're moved and inspired by what we see here.
Do you consider Jerusalem, and we're sitting at the King David Hotel here in Jerusalem, do you consider Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel?
Yes, of course. A nation has the capacity to choose its own capital city, and Jerusalem is Israel's capital.
If you become president of the United States, would you move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
I think it's long been the policy of our country to ultimately have our embassy in the nation's capital of Jerusalem. The decision to actually make the move is one, if I were president, I would want to take in consultation with the leadership of the government, which exists at that time. I would follow the same policy we have in the past. Our embassy would be in the capital, but that's the timing of that is something I'd want to work out with the government.
With the government of Israel?
With the government of Israel.
But every Israeli government has always asked every U.S. government to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Well, that would make the decision easy, but I would still want to have that communication with the governmental leaders.
Just to be precise, if you're president, you would consult with the Israeli government, and if they said, please move the embassy, you would do that.
I'm not going to make foreign policy for my nation, particularly while I'm on foreign soil. My understanding is the policy of our nation has been a desire to move our embassy ultimately to the capital. That's something which I would agree with, but I would only want to do so and to select the timing in accordance with the government of Israel.
Because you know that every U.S. president since '67, since the Six-Day War in 1967, behind you is the old city of Jerusalem. You see the beautiful walls there. And we're not far away, but the pre-67 line was in front of those old walls. But since then, every president from Nixon to LBJ to Carter, Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, President Clinton, now Obama, considers East Jerusalem, including the old city behind you, to be occupied territory, not part of Israel. Would you change that?
I'm not going to talk about the borders. The decision as to where the borders would be as we move to a two-state solution, which I support, that's a decision on borders that will be worked out by the Israelis and the Palestinians. I hope that's a process which is ongoing and ultimately successful. But as to the exact location of borders, that's something I'll leave to the negotiating parties themselves.
You just visited the Western Wall, one of the holiest sites in Judaism, in the old city of Jerusalem. I'm sure it was a moving experience for you. We saw the pictures, the video. Do you consider that to be part of Israel?
It is certainly part of Israel. The decision, however, as we move to a two-state solution as to what would be part of Israel and what would be part of a Palestinian state is something to be negotiated by the Palestinians and the Israelis. I believe that the key to that negotiation is the recognition that there will be a Palestinian state and there will be a Jewish state.
And so you support a two-state solution. Do you support a two-state solution, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, basically along the lines, the pre-67 lines, with what are called mutually agreed swaps, mutually agreed by the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I support a two-state solution as the appropriate direction for the solution of the hostility, if you will, that exists between peoples here. But I also recognize that the borders will have to be negotiated by the respective parties. And the original 67 borders will by themselves are not indefensible from the standpoint of Israel, and therefore there will have to be adjustments from those precise borders in order to reach a solution that is satisfactory to both parties.
So basically, the negotiations shouldn't assume that that it would be based on the pre-67 lines with mutually agreed swaps. You say go in and start negotiating.
I'm not being that specific. I'm saying that there will be borders that have to be negotiated, and what the starting point is something which will be decided by the parties involved. What the ending point is will be decided by the parties involved.
Could you see the future Palestinian state, and you support a two-state solution, Palestine and Israel, having East Jerusalem as its capital?
I don't want to, again, negotiate for the parties. My view is that the right course for America is to stand by our ally, Israel, to support them in their negotiating posture. I recognize that as negotiations begin, the postures of the respective parties will be different than the ultimate solution. But I'm not going to give up Israeli bargaining positions from the beginning, nor demand of the Palestinians a certain outcome. My view is that the United States' role is to stand by our ally, to show not a dime's worth of distance diplomatically between us and Israel, to work to bring the parties together and to see progress, but not to weaken the prospects of progress and of an agreement at some point by virtue of placing an American position on the table that might be different than that of our ally.
Would you ask Israel to freeze settlement activity on the West Bank?
I believe that the issue of settlements is something which should be discussed in private by the American president and our allies. Again, when we show a diplomatic distance between ourselves and our ally, I think we encourage people who oppose that relationship to seek other means to achieve their ends. I think the best thing we can do is to communicate very clearly to the Palestinians as well as to our friends the Israelis that the way to peace is for them to meet and to resolve their differences rather than to look to us to resolve that difference or to look to the United Nations to do it. So I just don't think my role, particularly as a candidate, is to begin suggesting what the terms of an agreement might look like.
Let's talk about Iran, because you've been very robust in saying that you will not, as president, accept Iran with nuclear weapons. So be specific. What would you do to make sure that would never happen?
Well, I spoke about 5 years ago at the Herzliya conference and laid out 7 steps that I thought were necessary to keep Iran from pursuing their nuclear folly. One of those steps, of course, was crippling sanctions, and it's taken a long time for those sanctions to finally be put in place. They could be, I'm sure, even more punitive relative to Iran, but that's a positive step. There are other steps that have not yet been followed. One other step, of course, is to make sure that we have credible military options that are available to us if no other of the initiatives is successful. Clearly, we all hope that diplomatic and economic pressures put on Iran will dissuade them from becoming a nuclear capability nation. But if all else fails, we, of course, have to keep a military option available.
But there are extensive contingency plans in place at the Pentagon and elsewhere in the U.S. government for that military option already. I don't know if you've been briefed on all that kind of stuff, but they do have plans to do that if the President of the United States were to give that order.
My guess is that neither you nor I have the full access to all of the plans that might exist for military options, either on the part of the United States or, for that matter, with our friends in Israel. But I certainly hope that our military, under the direction of the President, has in fact prepared a whole series of contingency plans, not only to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear, but to respond were Iran to become more belligerent in its efforts. So I can't speak for the military, having seen their plans at this point.
At some point, you will be briefed by U.S. intelligence, right? After the convention.
After the convention, I'll get a more.
They start giving you.
I'll get a more full briefing on classified material. Yes.
Yeah. And I assume at that point, you'll hear what I've been told that there are. I don't know what they are, but there are all sorts of military options. But just to be precise on the Iran point, if the sanctions, the political sanctions, the economic sanctions, the diplomatic sanctions don't work, and Iran is about to develop a nuclear bomb, U.S. President would authorize a military strike.
I think I've said it as clearly as our president has. Again, I don't want to make foreign policy on foreign soil or say something different than our nation. Our president has said, and I have said, that it is unacceptable for Iran to become nuclear. And that would mean that if all other options were to fail, and they have not all been exercised, they've not all been executed at their most extreme level, but if all other options, diplomatic, political, economic, fail, then a military option is one which would be available to the President of the United States.
Now, Syria. Let's talk about Syria for a moment. You want Bashar al-Assad to go. Everybody wants, apparently, Bashar al-Assad to go. But what would you do specifically to make that happen? I'll give you a few options. Would you send in U.S. military forces on the ground?
Well, again, Wolf, because I'm on foreign soil, and because it's long been a policy of both political parties to leave politics at the water's edge, I'm not going to go through specific foreign policy prescriptions for Syria, other than to say that that the removal of Assad as the leader in Syria is a high priority for our nation, as you know. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, agree with that. We also are highly concerned about the disposition of chemical weapons, which exist in some large measure in Syria. We do not see a unified opposition having been formed yet in Syria. An action that is being taken of a kinetic nature in Syria is being led by Arab League nations, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, and others. And when I say actions kinetically, I'm referring to armament and counsel and advice. But our nation is involved with other nations in helping move a process that will stop the slaughter of innocent life in Syria, and ultimately have a more representative form of government.
We're going to have a lot more of my conversation. Mitt Romney says he came here to Jerusalem to deliver an important message to the people of Israel and to the leaders of Iran. The Republican presidential contender is promising to support any and all measures, a direct quote, any and all measures to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear bomb. I asked Romney about that and much more in our one-on-one interview here in Jerusalem. Let's talk about Iran, because you've been very robust in saying that you will not, as president, accept Iran with nuclear weapons. So be specific. What would you do to make sure that would never happen?
Well, I spoke about 5 years ago at the Herzliya conference and laid out 7 steps that I thought were necessary to keep Iran from pursuing their nuclear folly. One of those steps, of course, was crippling sanctions, and it's taken a long time for those sanctions to finally be put in place. They could be, I'm sure, even more punitive relative to Iran, but that's a positive step. There are other steps that have not yet been followed. One other step, of course, is to make sure that we have credible military options that are available to us if no other of the initiatives is successful. Clearly, we all hope that diplomatic and economic pressures put on Iran will dissuade them from becoming a nuclear capability nation. But if all else fails, we, of course, have to keep a military option available.
But just to be precise on the Iran point, if the sanctions, the political sanctions, the economic sanctions, the diplomatic sanctions don't work, and Iran is about to develop a nuclear bomb, U.S. president would authorize a military strike.
I think I've said it as clearly as our president has. Again, I don't want to make foreign policy on foreign soil or say something different than our nation. Our president has said, and I have said, that it is unacceptable for Iran to become nuclear. And that would mean that if all other options were to fail, and they have not all been exercised, they've not all been executed at their most extreme level, but if all other options, diplomatic, political, economic, fail, then a military option is one which would be available to the President of the United States.
The last time you and I spoke in an interview, you told me that Russia was America's #1 geostrategic foe. Do you still believe that?
Well, there's no question, but that in terms of geopolitics, I'm talking about votes at the United Nations and actions of a geopolitical nature. Russia is the #1 adversary in that regard. That doesn't make them an enemy. It doesn't make them a combatant. They don't represent the #1 national security threat. The #1 national security threat, of course, to our nation is a nuclear Iran. And time continues to pass. They continue to move towards nuclearization. This is more and more disconcerting and dangerous to the world. But Russia, particularly look at a place like Syria, Russia has supported the Assad regime, even as it has been attacking its own people. Russia, likewise, has been slow to move to the kinds of sanctions that have been called for in Iran. Russia is a geopolitical adversary, but is not an enemy with missiles being fired at one another, or things of that nature.
All right, I'm glad you clarified that. On a timeline for withdrawal from Afghanistan, U.S. troops, the other day at the Veterans of Foreign Wars, you said you support bringing back all U.S. troops by the end of 2014, which is what the Obama administration negotiated as well. But earlier, you seemed to say that you wanted to consult with commanders. You didn't want a hard timeline or deadline for withdrawing from Afghanistan to announce what was going on. Do I sense there's been a change in your position?
No, it's the same posture I've had all along, which is that I believe the right target for us is to withdraw our troops by the end of 2014. At the same time, and in the speech I gave at the VFW, I said I would, however, also want to consult with commanders on the ground to make sure that that timeline was still the appropriate timeline, and that is something which I will continue to point out.
As someone who organized and ran the Winter Olympic Games, and all of us know you did an excellent job at that. Should there have been a moment of silence at the opening ceremonies for these summer games in London in memory of those Israeli athletes who were killed in Munich in 1972?
I expressed my belief actually before the games that there should have been a moment of silence on the 40-year anniversary of the brutal massacre of the Israeli athletes in Munich. I think recognizing the sacrifice and the horror of terror, even at the Olympics, is something which should not be lost on the people who weren't around or may not remember those terrible events.
On a political question, and we're getting ready to wrap it up, but all this money that's coming out, being raised in super PAC money, we're here in Jerusalem. One of your big supporters, Sheldon Adelson, is here. He has said he's ready to commit $100 million to super PACs to help defeat the President of the United States. All this money coming in, is this appropriate? What do you think about this?
Well, I must admit, I think I made very clear in my campaign in 2008 that I felt that the fundraising regulations and rules that exist in our country don't make a lot of sense. In fact, as you know, a candidate is able to raise a maximum of $2,500 for his or her campaign, a federal candidate. But there can be a super PAC on behalf of that candidate that takes millions of dollars. This just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I think we need to revisit. I hope at some point we're able to revisit our campaign finance laws and to have candidates responsible for the advertising of their own campaign, as opposed to having advertising and the message of a campaign oftentimes being spoken of more loudly by outside groups than by the candidate, him or herself. But what we've done is, by limiting what a candidate's campaign can receive at $2,500, we've now only opened up a way for people to that want to make a difference in a campaign to give to some outside group that can't be coordinated by the candidate. So the candidate gets the benefit of the money, but the disadvantage of not being able to, if you will, control the message and make sure that what these outside groups say is consistent with their beliefs. I think we've got it backwards. I'd rather see contributions going to candidates and having candidates take responsibility for what's said.
Because a lot of people are concerned if he's going to put in $100 million in his personal wealth, and I think Forbes says he's worth about $20 billion. A lot of those billions he earned obviously legally at casinos, not only in Las Vegas, but in China, in Macau, China, and people are a little antsy about that if you get the drift of the question.
Well, you'd have to talk to Mr. Adelson. As I understand it, his contributions are to a wide array of causes, but that are generally associated with conservative principles. And don't forget, there'll be hundreds of millions coming in from the CEOs of labor unions, not directed by their individual members, but directed entirely by the CEO of a union. And we have a very strange financial system for our campaigns right now, where campaigns are highly limited in what they can receive, but then vast sums, potentially, tens of millions, hundreds of millions potentially, in contributions are coming by outside groups that can't be controlled by the campaigns. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, okay, we're out of time. One final thought. You're in Jerusalem right now. You're a religious individual. Give us a little sense of what this city means to you, the Holy Land, as someone who obviously believes in God and has a deep commitment to his faith?
Well, as you know, I'm running for a secular position, not a religious position, but on a personal basis, being in the Holy City is very moving for me. I believe very deeply in the promises that were made in this place. I believe in the mission of Jesus Christ. Believe he walked the very streets that we're walking, and it's very moving and emotional. For anyone of deep faith to be in a place which is sacred to my faith, sacred to people of the Jewish faith, sacred to Muslims, and it's amazing how many religions count this as a holy place. Whatever your religion, I think being here draws you closer to the divine and makes you recognize that we are all children of the same God. And hopefully coming here, people recognize that we should draw together and not fight like little children, but instead act like adults that God created us to be.
Well said. I felt exactly the same way earlier today. I spent a few hours walking around the old city, and I totally appreciate what you're saying. Good luck. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf. Good to be with you. Take care.
Thank you.